Making a video about Stéphane Grappelli, the great jazz legend, feels somewhat personal in a sense. Not that I ever met Grappelli, or sadly even had the opportunity to attend one of his concerts. But maybe it's because Stéphane Grappelli went to Alfredo Campoli for violin lessons at one period during his career. And Alfredo Campoli was also my violin teacher's teacher. And that's how I found out about that. But he's certainly an exciting violinist, and if you're into jazz music like I am, he's definitely one worth checking out. Stéphane Grappelli was a French violinist whose flowing, relaxed playing style and improvisation helped elevate the genre of jazz violin in the 20th century, garnering him the nickname Grandfather of the Jazz Violin. Here are some highlights of his life to begin with. He was born on the 26th of January 1908 in Paris. He started playing violin at the age of 12. He played with Django Reinhardt and the Quintette du Haut Club de France. He recorded albums with Yehudi Menuhin and collaborated with other artists. His career, after a slump, was revived in the 1970s. And then Grappelli continued touring with great success up to the last year of his life. He died in Paris on the 1st of December 1997, aged 89. As we will see, there are some ups and downs in his life, but overall, a success story. He was born at Hôpital Lariboisière in Paris. His father was an Italian called Ernesto Grappelli, who had been born in Alatri, Lazio, while his French mother, Anna Emilie Anouk, was from Saint-Omer. Sadly, Grappelli's mother died when he was only 5 years old, leaving his father Ernesto as the sole parent. Ernesto was a scholar who taught Italian, sold translations, and wrote articles for local journals. As he was an Italian citizen, he was drafted into the Italian army at the outbreak of the First World War, leaving Stéphane in the care of a US dancer called Isadore Duncan. And so it was that Grappelli was enrolled in Duncan's dance school at the age of 6, and it was there that he learned to love French Impressionist music. But with the threat of war looming, Duncan fled the country, leaving Stéphane in a Catholic orphanage. When Stéphane Grappelli recalled those years, he said, "I look back at it as an abominable memory. The place was supposed to be under the eye of the government, but the government looked elsewhere. We slept on the floor and often were without food. There were many times when I had to fight for a crust of bread." He said that once, he even tried to eat flies to ease his hunger. Following his time in the orphanage, which he later described as Dickensian, Stéphane was reunited with his father after the war in 1918, where they settled in Barbès, Paris. Having been sickened by his experiences in the Italian military, Ernesto took Stéphane to City Hall, pulled 2 witnesses off the street, and had his son naturalised as a French citizen on the 28th of July 1919. So his first name Stefano was Gallicised to Stéphane. Grappelli began playing the violin at the age of 12 on a 3/4 sized instrument which his father had purchased by pawning a suit. He took lessons, but he preferred to learn by observing street musicians. He recalled, "My first lessons were in the streets, watching how other violinists played. The first violinist that I saw play was at the Barbès metro station, sheltered under the overhead metro tracks. When I asked how one should play, he exploded in laughter. I left, completely humiliated, with my violin under my arm." Eventually, Stéphane Grappelli did make it into the Paris Conservatoire, where he attended from 1920 to 1923. His father had hoped that it would give him a chance to learn music theory, ear training and solfeggio, and he graduated with a second-tier medal. Around this time, his father married a woman named Anna Fuchs, and they moved to Strasbourg. Grappelli, however, remained in Paris because he disliked his father's new wife, and so he had to support himself from the age of 15 by busking. His busking and playing caught the attention of an elderly violinist who invited him to accompany silent films in the pit orchestra at the Théâtre Gaumont. And so it was that Stéphane Grappelli was hired to accompany silent films. He also played in hotel orchestras at this time. During orchestra breaks, he visited Le Boudon, a brasserie where he would listen to songs from an American proto-jukebox. This is how he was first introduced to jazz. In 1928, Grappelli was a member of the orchestra at the Ambassador Hotel, while band leader Paul Whiteman and jazz violinist Joe Venuti were performing there. Grappelli was struck by Venuti's bowing when he played a tune called Dinah, and this would influence Grappelli's own technique. So this was a proper introduction to jazz violin after Stéphane Grappelli encountered the jazz violinist Joe Venuti. Grappelli lived for a while with Michel Warlop, who was a classically trained violinist. For a time, Grappelli actually stopped playing the violin, switching to piano, which offered more lucrative work. And in 1929, Grappelli was actually a pianist with Gregor's orchestra. Gregor was a leader of a big band. Sometime in 1929, after a night of drinking, the band leader Gregor learned that Grappelli used to play the violin. Gregor borrowed a violin and asked Grappelli to improvise over Dinah. Yes, that same tune that he'd heard Joe Venuti play a year earlier. Delighted by Grappelli's fiddle improvisations, Gregor urged Grappelli to return to playing the violin. And whilst we're on the topic of improvisations, there's something that has largely been lost from classical music. In Mozart's time, it was alive and well. So this is where jazz has the edge. Anyone that tells you that jazz is harder than classical is talking rubbish. You can never improvise the Paganini Caprice No. 7. It has to be scored to push the technique through the roof, beyond the limit of the possible. However, where jazz has the edge nowadays is in this field of improvisations. Even though I love Grappelli, and I love jazz, I do at times struggle to see the violin as a jazz instrument. For me, jazz instruments are like bass or double bass, drums, trumpet, trombone, saxophone, piano, guitar, and so on. And the voice. The violin kind of sounds somewhat out of place at times. So I have to approach it with an open mind and try and see past my own reservations when it comes to the violin and jazz. But if anyone was going to break the ice for me, it would be Stéphane Grappelli. And I remind myself that improvisation is a skill that's been kept alive by jazz because it has pretty much died in the classical world, which is a sad thing in a way. People play it too safe these days. And in the jazz world, you don't play it safe. You work within safe boundaries, but the transcendence comes not so much in the interpretation as in Heifetz playing Max Bruch, Scottish fantasy, but the transcendence here really comes in the improvisation and what flows out of the heart through the fingers to produce a sound. Anyway, let's get back to the story. Because in 1930, Gregor ran into financial trouble. He was involved in an automobile accident that resulted in several deaths, and so he fled to South America to avoid arrest. Gregor's band reunited as a jazz ensemble under the leadership of pianist Alain Roman and saxophonist André Etienne. And it was while playing with this band that Grappelli met gypsy jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt in 1931. Django was of course the legendary jazz guitarist who only had 2 functional fingers on his left fretting hand for soloing. because the ring and pinky had been severely damaged and partially paralysed in a 1928 caravan fire. Another example of how a musician is not necessarily hampered by disability, and I've explored that topic in another short video recently. Seeking a violinist who was interested in jazz, Django invited Grappelli to play with him in his caravan. Can you imagine the two of them jamming in an old gypsy caravan? Although the two played for hours that afternoon, their commitments to their respective bands preventing them from pursuing a career together at that point. 3 years passed, after which the two then formed the Quintet du Haut Club de France in 1934, with Louis Vola on bass and Joseph Reinhardt and Roger Chaput on guitars. This was one of the first all-string jazz bands. Also located in the Montmartre district was the artistic salon of R26, at which Grappelli and Reinhardt performed regularly. The quintet disbanded in 1939 due to the outbreak of the Second World War. Grappelli was in London at the time and decided to stay there for the duration of the war, a wise choice, and possibly that is where he encountered Camperly, who had drifted into salon playing at that time in order to survive economically. More on Grappelli and Alfredo Camperly later in the video. In 1940, jazz pianist George Shearing made his debut as a sideman in Grappelli's band. But Grappelli and Reinhardt continued to play together after the war ended. Reinhardt first came to England for a reunion with Grappelli, and they recorded some titles in London with the English Quintet during January and February 1946 for EMI and Decca, using a rhythm section consisting of English guitarists Jack Llewellyn and Alan Hodgkiss, together with the Jamaican jazz bassist Coleridge Good. And Grappelli occasionally toured and recorded with Reinhardt thereafter. Grappelli chose to remain in England while Reinhardt returned to Paris before undertaking an only moderate successful visit to the United States, where he performed in a new style using an amplified archtop guitar with Duke Ellington's orchestra. But on Reinhardt's return from the States, he and Grappelli reunited periodically for concerts on occasions when the latter was visiting Paris. However, the pre-war quintet was never reformed. Django and Stéphane also briefly toured Italy, where they were supported by an Italian rhythm section of piano, bass and drums. The tour was documented with around 50 tracks recorded for an Italian radio station, about half of which can be heard on the album Djangology, which was released in 2005. This was to be the last set of recordings featuring the pair, with Reinhardt moving into a more bebop modern jazz idiom and playing with younger French musicians prior to his early death in 1953, aged only 43. While bebop became the dominant jazz idiom in the post-war years, Grappelli did not transition and instead chose to remain a swing player. Throughout the 1950s, he made occasional visits to the recording studio, but the opportunities for a swing violinist of his generation were becoming limited. Despite attempts to modernise his style, Grappelli was never particularly interested in the bebop style, which was then fashionable in the jazz world. I suppose the thought is, why do it if it doesn't float your boat? Stay true to your own artistic ideals. So he got left behind, but it was a conscious decision on his part. He made a brief filmed appearance in Paul Paviot's 1957 film Django Reinhardt, in which he plays minor swing alongside Joseph Reinhardt, Henri Collat and others. In the 60s, Grappelli made regular appearances on the BBC Light programme, French Public Radio and the pirate station Radio Luxembourg. In 1967 he returned to Paris to take up a regular engagement providing music for dinners at the Toit de Paris restaurant in the Paris Hilton Hotel, a position he kept up until 1972, for it provided regular work plus accommodation at the hotel. He played in a standard lounge jazz format accompanied by a pianist and drummer. Grappelli was making a living but by now had very little impact on the jazz world. But wouldn't it be fantastic if you could travel back to, say, 1969 and go for coffee in the Paris Hilton and hear Grappelli playing with his lounge jazz band? And so Grappelli had lapsed into relative obscurity until his rediscovery in the 1970s, when a new generation of fans discovered the hot club sound. Concert tours and many new recordings followed to much acclaim. No doubt, a key event that kick-started his career again was when he famously appeared with violinist Yehudi Menuhin on Michael Parkinson's Chat Show in 1971, where the two musicians performed a duet. Despite their differing musical origins, with Menuhin distinctly classically trained as opposed to Grappelli's less formal training, the duo's performance was considered a success with the British public. The pair would go on to record 3 albums together between 1972 and 1976. It was in 1973 that British guitarist Diz Disley had the idea of prizing Grappelli away from his lounge jazz format with piano players to play once again with the backing of acoustic guitars and double bass, recreating a version of the hot club sound, but now with Grappelli as sole leader. And he was given a rapturous reception for the new old format group at that year's Cambridge Folk Festival, after which he favoured the guitar-based trio with double bass for a series of increasingly successful concert tours around the globe. Other guitarists in the British Diz Disley trio providing his instrumental backing over the years included Denny Wright, Ike Isaacs, the Irish guitarist Lewis Stewart, John Etheridge and Martin Taylor, while double bass was often provided by Dutchman Jack Sewing. In his later years, Grappelli also used a Parisian trio which included guitarist Marc Fosset and bassist Patrice Caratini. In April 1973, Grappelli performed with great success during a week at Jazz Power in Milan, accompanied by Italian jazz musicians Franco Cherry, Pino Presti, Tullio De Piscopo. And Grappelli played on hundreds of recordings, including sessions with Duke Ellington, Oscar Peterson, Michel Petrucciani, Claude Bolling, and also collaborated with jazz violinists Sven Asmussen, Jean-Luc Ponty and Stuff Smith. Indian classical violinist L. Subramanian, and many others including Andre Previn, Joe Pass, Yo-Yo Ma, Toots Thielemans and others. Grappelli also composed the scores for French films such as Going Places of 1974 and Mayfalls of 1990. And he made a cameo appearance in the 1978 film King of the Gypsies with mandolinist David Grisman. 3 years later they performed together in concert. He also made a 1975 cameo as a violinist in Little House on the Prairie Season 2 Episode 8. In the 1980s, he gave several concerts with British cellist Julian Lloyd Webber. And in 1997, he received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and he is an inductee of the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. Grappelli continued performing and touring up to the last year of his life in 1997, including a UK tour and performances in Australia and New Zealand. Let's talk a little bit about Grappelli's family life. In May 1935, Grappelli had a brief affair with Sylvia Caro that resulted in a daughter named Evelyn. Sylvia remained in Paris with her daughter for the duration of World War II. Father and daughter were reunited in 1946, when Evelyn travelled to London from France to stay with Grappelli for about a year. From 1952 to 1980, he shared much of his life with a female friend, Jean Barclay, for whom he felt deep affection. Grappelli never married, however, and it is widely accepted that he was gay. In 1981, he met Joseph Oldenhove, who would be his companion until his death. So here's where we come to the topic of Stéphane Grappelli taking lessons with Alfredo Campelli. So this was after he was already an established star, and I think the motive was that he wanted to brush up on his classical technique and improve it. I found out about this from my teacher Ron Lima, who was also a student of Campelli. I was unsure if it could be verified, not that I doubt Ron's testimony. However, I did find some evidence online that Grappelli had taken lessons with Campelli, but what I found online suggests that he didn't enjoy the lessons too much, describing them as worse than going to the dentist. Of course, in terms of classical music, Alfredo Campelli was in a different league altogether than Grappelli, but it must have been nice for him to build on his technique by delving back into the classics. Stéphane Grappelli made his final recording, 4 tracks, with the classical violinist Iwao Furusawa, plus guitarist Marc Fosset and bassist Philippe Viret, in Paris in August 1996. Released as Time Goes By, Stéphane Grappelli and Iwao Furusawa. He died in Paris on the 1st of December 1997, aged 89. Suffering heart failure after a series of minor cerebral attacks. His funeral on the 5th December 1997 took place at the Église Saint-Vincent de Paul, Paris, within sight of the entrance to the Lariboisière Hospital, where he had been born some 89 years earlier. His body was cremated and his ashes entombed in the city's Père Lachaise cemetery. Which is a shame in a way, because if I'd realised that he was in Père Lachaise when I visited Paris last year to find Ginette Neveu's grave, I probably would have tried to find his one. So that's one for the future when I'm next in Paris, I guess. Now apparently, Grappelli recorded an uncredited violin solo for the title track of Pink Floyd's 1975 album Wish You Were Here at the Abbey Road Studios. The collaboration was accidental. Grappelli was recording nearby with Yehudi Menuhin. Long thought lost, the recording was featured on the 2011 Experience and Immersion box set reissues. He recorded a solo on the track Wish You Were Here. However, the original recording was barely audible in the final mix and Grappelli was not credited. But after the track was remastered, Grappelli's contribution became audible. Apparently, because he and Menuhin were recording at Abbey Road Studios at the same time as Pink Floyd, Yehudi and Stéphane both popped in to say hello to Pink Floyd, according to the band's drummer Nick Mason. He said that was delightful. Someone plucked up the courage to ask them both if they'd like to play something on the record. Stéphane absolutely was up for it, and I think Yehudi would have liked to, but he's not an improviser, and I think he felt he just couldn't do it. Which goes back to what I say about improvisation in jazz, where jazz has the edge. Although I'm pretty sure Ivry Gitlis would have given it a go. Let's talk a little bit about Grappelli's violins. There was, of course, the 3/4 size violin that he received when he was 12, after his father pawned a suit for it. That was his first instrument. During his 1971 television appearance on Parkinson with Menuhin, Grappelli revealed that he played a violin by Goffredo Capper, made in 1695, alongside Menuhin's 1714 Soil Stradivari violin. He also played on a Niccolo Galliano violin from 1742, a Montagnana, and a violin made by archtop guitar maker Robert Benedetto in 1987. 2 fun facts as we conclude this video on Stéphane Grappelli. For the first 3 decades of his career, he was billed using a Gallicized spelling of his last name, Grappelli, reverting to the Italian spelling Grappelli in 1969. He is the subject of the documentary Stéphane Grappelli, A Life in the Jazz Century.